Did you ever wonder who's responsible for setting policy on foreign student visas and what role U.S. universities and colleges play in the process? Stay tuned. We'll talk with representatives from the UCLA International Student Services and a prominent constitutional attorney for immigration issues. Next on Full Disclosure. Hello, I'm Leslie Dutton. Today on Full Disclosure, we're going to bring you the news behind the news about foreign student visas and the international student programs. Our guests today are experts on this subject. Our first guest is Jim White with the UCLA Office of International Student Services. He holds a master's degree in international and comparative law from the Free University in Brussels, Belgium. And he provides legal counsel to UCLA students who are here on F1 foreign student visas. Our other guest is Richard Knickerbocker, a constitutional attorney on immigration issues and who was the prevailing attorney on the Bradford case regarding in-state tuition. Thank you for joining us for this part two. There's so many questions to ask you about this foreign student visa process. And people wonder how the policy is developed. Who decides? We know that there was an Immigration Reform Act and the INS is involved. Could you kind of describe to us from your perspective?
Well, certainly the act is done by Congress, and then they send the act to the central office of the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, to promulgate the proper regulations to implement the commands of the act. And then from there, the regions and the district offices set up procedures to follow up on the requirements of the act. But that's basically the broad brush on how the law is developed for immigration, foreign students.
Well, we've heard so much about all the loopholes and oops, they forgot this and that, and like reporting and so on. When a reform is passed, and the INS goes to implement regulations and process,
yes,
is it subject to influence from special interests in the country?
Yes, they usually put some material out in the Federal Register that invites comments by the public or by interested groups. And our national group, NAFSA, National Association for Foreign Student Affairs, Association of International Educators, is very, very active and keeps close tabs on any new proposals. And we're often asked to provide input on proposed legislation or proposed regulations.
So when you're asked,
yes,
who asked you? Your association asked you for your input, or is it the INS that asked you for your input?
Well, the INS puts it out and invites the comments, and then our association, if there's a relative consensus about how we feel as a community, then they'll ask us to get involved in pushing a certain position. Sometimes we independently take a position and respond to those proposals. So the impetus can come from any direction.
I read an article that said that there was a proposal, a legislative proposal,
yes,
to require that the universities report to the INS if foreign students dropped out or transferred or just didn't show up.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I read,
mm-hmm,
that the proposal was defeated by the higher education lobby. Is that possible?
It's possible.
Why?
There's a lot of people in our field who feels that the less government intervention or the less we're responsible for reporting to the government, then the better off we are. But there are people who feel that way. A lot of people, a lot of our colleagues in the international education field feels that way.
I see. And if you could describe for our viewers, what is the higher education lobby? What does that consist of?
Well, it's a consortium of interest. Like I said, our national group, and then there are other education groups that take on issues on all levels, including higher education. And then there's specific regional and geographical based interests that have a stake in one thing over another. I think every state that has colleges and universities often asks their legislators to get involved in lobbying one way or the other for, higher education issues.
Would you describe for us the higher education lobby? What % would be public education versus private?
That's hard to say because it's so intricately, interwoven.
Uh-huh.
We're all in the same community, basically, and we don't distinguish amongst ourselves, oh, that's public, that's private. Like USC and UCLA, as big a rivals as we are in many, areas, sports, academics, social partying, etc., we often speak with a common voice on issues concerning higher ed policies and procedures. So we usually don't distinguish within our community private versus public.
It's almost ironic that the public sector would oppose more government interference, isn't it? Richard Knickerbocker, could you give us your thoughts on this?
Well, I think one of the things that's important is that we recognize that we have two types of power. We have federal power and we have state power. The states aren't supposed to be enemies of the federal government, and the federal government's not supposed to be enemies of the state. The federal government has the authority to preempt the local government from legislating, even though the Constitution may theoretically provide otherwise. The federal government has a power to make the determinations as to whether local governments can legislate. There's a lot of difference between the needs and the interests of states such as Texas and California, Oregon, which are on the coast, particularly California and Texas, Florida. These states have different interests than the country as a whole. Whenever a state tries to legislate, they are always met with a constitutional challenge that the Immigration and Naturalization Act has basically preempted the field and they can do nothing. The problem is the state can do nothing, the federal government does nothing for one reason or another, and the safety and health and rights of American citizens are jeopardized.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Controversial. Who stopped the Clinton impeachment campaign?
I literally brought the nation to a stop.
Informative.
The overall cost is, some of the figures I've seen, in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
Entertaining.
They're playing a fool's game.
You're absolutely wrong there. Only 23% of Latino voters voted for that measure.
Full Disclosure, TV's best public affairs program, is seen throughout California. For channel numbers, airtimes, and streaming video, go to fulldisclosure.net. The news behind the news.
Welcome back to Full Disclosure. We're talking with Jim White of the UCLA International Student Services at UCLA and Richard Knickerbocker, our constitutional attorney. Speaking of public policy and the foreign student visas, as a part of the aftermath of the September 11th tragedy with the World Trade Center and the implications that a foreign student was involved, Senator Dianne Feinstein has now announced that she's considering introducing a proposal which would freeze all of foreign student visas for 6 months. What kind of an impact would that have on a university like UCLA?
I think it would be relatively drastic. I don't think it would be the end of the world, but I think it would affect a lot of ongoing research. It would affect a lot of programs that are ongoing, especially if the moratorium reached the postdoc students, postdoctoral students, who have a lot of research responsibilities in the school. But overall, generally, I think it would affect negatively our educational community. Individual schools depends on exactly what kind of programs they have that they haven't already admitted students to for this year. Like this year, now, most of our foreign students are in place for the coming year. There are some expected probably in January for the winter quarter and in April for the spring quarter. But, you know, the biggest group is already here. I think we got about 500 to 600 new students just came for this year. Probably less than 100 to be forthcoming in January and less than 100 for April. But it would have an effect. And it would not be a good backdrop for us to operate from. It would also affect the ability of students to travel probably and do research or participate in conferences and other types of professional fora and meetings that are required sometimes of graduate students.
Well, Richard Knickerbocker, what other alternative could there be to a drastic measure like that? Would just maybe identifying where they are or if they're here?
Well, I think some of the things that I had said previously make more sense. I think that if we approach the problem with an axe and just say no, automatically no, and we're going to have a moratorium, maybe it needs a lot of study, but there's a lot of things that don't need a lot of study. I mean, there's some things which are pretty obvious as to how to deal with it. And we don't have to say no to every country in the world either. We have countries who are our friends. We have countries who are not our friends.
Well, you know, you make a good point there. I read this article in U.S. News and World Report that said that in 1991, and of course that's quite a while ago, 11,000 visas had been issued to students from nations that sponsor terrorism. Yeah. There were 503 Iraqis, 5,154 Iranians, 113 Libyans, 3,227 Syrians, and on and on. What if Senator Feinstein were just to propose eliminating the visas from those countries that are considered hostile and not cooperating with us? Would that be more practical?
I think it's more practical, and I think that the advantage, these people don't have any equal protection rights. They're not American citizens. They aren't present, and they aren't persons within the country. So they do not have equal protection rights. And we have a right to make a determination of who we're going to allow in and who we're going to allow out. And we have not got the access to the information in those countries which is needed to make a credible determination as to whether these people should come in or not. So why not just say no unless these countries provide us with the same information? In other words, if a British citizen, we can check in Britain with regard to that citizen's rights, what they are, where they got their funding. If it's an Iranian citizen, I don't see that happening. So maybe we ought to just say no to Iranian students, Iraqis, those countries for which they will not provide us the information we seek in a credible fashion. It doesn't seem that that's unfair, unreasonable. It makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I shouldn't ask you this question because it's putting you on the hot seat, but I know a lot of people wonder, you know, when we see figures like this for the numbers of students coming from these countries that have terrorist connections, yes. Should there be a concern about what types of programs or research that those particular students from these hostile nations are involved in?
Yeah, and there is a concern. Like I said before, there was, or there is a requirement that if they're studying in a particular field, a sensitive field, that's on what's called a technology list, or the, you know, I'm not aware of all the fields on it, but there are some concerns, and there is this list, and those coming to study fields and subjects in those lists usually have to undergo an investigation. So there is some concern. Whether it's a comprehensive program that can deal with all the complexities of it or not, I'm not sure, but there is some concern.
And what about, there were some articles talking about the number of foreign students that were getting Pell grants. There's some question. Are the foreign students entitled to federal Pell grants?
I don't believe they are. You know, when you told me on the break that there was an article that said that some foreign students were getting it, that's news to me. Because when our foreign students come to my office and they ask for procedures to apply for financial aid, number one, we tell them it's not available for first-year foreign students. And secondly, it's not really something they can expect at all. I would say funding for foreign students at UCLA, other than teaching assistantships, research assistantships, and common jobs within the community of our university, in a bookstore, library, readerships, and things like that. Other than those kinds of jobs and types of jobs, there's not much foreign student support available.
Mr. Knickerbocker, constitutionally, do foreign students on visas have a right to scholarship grants like the Pell grants?
I think that it's not an absolute decision. I mean, there could be an argument the other way. I don't think that they would ever prevail in such an argument. As I indicated, the Equal Protection Clause applies, but the Equal Protection Clause is also governed by reason, and there appear to be reasons why not. That was one of the arguments argued in the Bradford case, for instance, and it was determined that that was not an equal. In other words, treating, for instance, illegals different than American citizens certainly was not was proper and within the constitutional dictates of the 14th Amendment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to ask our guests, to what extent do American citizens, students, have to compete with the foreign students coming here for admission on campus?
The website you've been looking to for accurate information has the best of Full Disclosure videos 24/7 at fulldisclosure.net. We're streaming TV's Emmy Award-winning Full Disclosure with Leslie Dutton, uncovering waste, exposing fraud, revealing corruption. So even if you miss us on TV, we're available when you want to watch. We've got the latest information on upcoming shows, a cable channel guide, and news about special series. fulldisclosure.net, the news behind the news.
Welcome back to Full Disclosure. We're talking about foreign student visas. Jim White, UCLA International Student Services. Is there a perception or is there a reality that the American students are competing with the foreign students for admissions and possibly even access to facilities? Are they taking up spaces that American students would like to have?
I would say at UCLA, no. It's certainly, in theory, competition. But the admissions pool, I believe, is separate. Domestic students and international students. There's a whole set of experts you need that are different to look over transcripts and backgrounds of foreign student applicants than the American students. I haven't seen the foreign student numbers at UCLA rise at all in the 20 years I've been there. I'll give you an example. When I first started working at UCLA in the capacity, in a different capacity as an assistant dean at the Foreign Student Office, we had about 2,000 foreign students. USC had about 2,000 foreign students. Now we have a little over 2,000 foreign students. USC, I believe, has 3,000 foreign students. So I don't see very much competition coming from the foreign students for slots that Americans should or could have at a campus like ours. Okay. Now, I don't know if that's generally true or not, but at UCLA I don't see it.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Knickerbocker, the computer is widely used and becoming more and more a part of everyday life. Mm-hmm. On campus, these computers are available. With the terrorist problem being a concern, do you see that there should be any restrictions with the use of computers and access to that if we don't really know who some of the students are?
Well, in general, been against, in terms of the litigation I've been involved in, I've been against a lot of restrictions on the use of computers, mainly because I think that people should have some rights with regard to computer usage. The only way we're going to be able to make a determination as to whether they're rightfully or wrongfully used is by monitoring the use of the computers. The cases generally have said if the university owns the computer, they can monitor the computer, and that seems to be the way to the authority right now. And it becomes particularly the weight of authority if the student using the computer signs a waiver and indicates that may be anything they do may be monitored and personal use is prohibited. Those kind of things and restrictions do make sense. They should be carefully drawn. We should not restrict anybody's right to gain information, but we should also be very, very careful that we don't allow these computers to be abused or to be used for purposes which are unlawful. I think it's even prohibited that they be used for any personal purpose. And I think that perhaps in a situation, particularly in the climate we're living in right now, that kind of a restriction should be enforced.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of any cases across the country where an American student was bumped off of a research project or a special program in preference for a international student?
You know, the truth, I haven't. And I'm pretty privy to most of the cases that go along. It may happen that just because there's only so much money or there's only so much time and there's only so much access, even if we do separate the standards with regard to foreign students and domestic students, that we create an unfairness. There was a potential for unfairness because you could take the position that if you have different standards, you could have easier standards for foreign students rather than more difficult standards. And so we would be, in effect, supplanting a person who was more qualified for a person who was less qualified, merely because they're a foreign student rather than a student who was a United States citizen.
In that regard, Jim White, is it required that the students be proficient in English?
Absolutely, and parlay on Richard's statement, it's even more competitive in the foreign student pool than in the American pool. I think the average standards are a little bit higher for the foreign students. I don't know why, but it seems that way. And our foreign students coming in, they're ready to compete, and the American students, they don't mind competing with them. You know, like Richard said, if fairness is the overall backdrop of it, I think any of our students have no problem to compete for something and maybe not get it because someone else was a little bit better that day or on that project or in that particular area at the time. And I think the competition, I think the diversity, the enriched environment that the foreign students offer on our campuses far outweigh any kind of perceived detriment of competition.
And you also mentioned, when we were talking about research projects,
yes,
that a number of the international students coming here are bringing some expertise that may not be available from the American students.
They bring expertise, they bring methodology and techniques that are sometimes different and a little bit better. I remember a professor told me about 7 or 8 years ago, we had a little bit of a dispute about the way the professor looked at a student's work in the exam, and because the student didn't do the work in the methodology that was taught, the professor at first dismissed it and failed it. But then upon asking the professor to review it and look at it, and then the student explaining the methodology he used, the professor came to me and he said, you know what, I learned something from that guy. He has a method of doing things that I think we can teach our students that gives them a little bit of a heads up on the other students in the country. So,
very good. Well, we have just about 30 seconds left in the program, and so I'm going to ask you if you'd like to make a closing remark here.
Well, I think there's a real need to have an open world and have an opportunity for us all to have an exchange of ideas and to have fairness govern it. There's also a policy which requires us to limit the access because of the crisis that we're under and because of the potential threat to our country. The threats existed for a long time. The Bradford case and the first bombing in 1993 happened at about the same time. Same policies were discussed, and it's now 2001, and we have done nothing other than we've had a terrible tragedy which may wake people up sufficiently for them to do what they should have done back in 1993. It's time that we reform our immigration policy, that we make it a high priority, one of the highest priorities, that we carry it through, that we give local government and universities the power to do something about things they see. They should not be manacled by federal government-imposed preemption. They should be allowed and directed to take responsibility and protect us as well as the Immigration and Naturalization Service does.
Thank you very much. We're all out of time, and I want to thank you so much. I'm sure this is an issue we'll be wanting to talk about more in the future, so we'd like to invite you both back. I want to thank our distinguished guests for coming on Full Disclosure today to share their perspectives with us on the foreign student visa process. We want to hear from you, the viewers, on this issue. What should be done about the foreign students who have dropped out of school but stayed on inside the United States? Should the universities try to locate them, or should the Immigration and Naturalization Service take action to find them and remove them from the country? Please call our Full Disclosure Town Hall number at 1-800-867-7777. That's 1-800-867-7777. And cast your vote and let us know what you think. You can email me at leslie@fulldisclosure.net. If you leave your name and number, we'll get back to you. I'm Leslie Dutton. Please join us next time for another edition of Full Disclosure. Thank you. The Full Disclosure Program is a non-commercial television program produced as a public service by the Citizens Protection Alliance, a non-profit 501c3 tax-exempt educational organization. If you would like a videotape copy or a transcript of our public service program, a listing of all Full Disclosure programs, and a channel guide with airtimes, please call us at our toll-free number at 1-800-867-7777 or visit our website at www.fulldisclosure.net. Be sure and leave your name, address, and phone number or email address, and we'll get back to you.